I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society. So I'm very excited today to talk with Dr. Margaret Leinen, and I have with me Dr. Ken Ford, who is IHMC's director.
Thanks, Don. It's really great that you'll be interviewing Margaret today. She's just fascinating.
She's actually kind of a personal hero of mine, given her background in oceanography and her diving experiences, which she'll share with us in today's interview. But Ken, you actually have a history with Dr. Leinen working together and serving together at the National Science Foundation, don't you?
Yes, and Margaret was the assistant director at the time, and I was on the National Science Board. And so we interacted a good bit, and I can just say that among the assistant directors, she was one of the very most effective and most pleasant to interact with.
Well, that's a unique set of characteristics, I think, for someone in a leadership and policy-making position. So after she was at the National Science Foundation, she moved to Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute here in Florida.
Absolutely, and did a great job there, and we've collaborated with Harbor Branch in the past. In fact, a person from Harbor Branch is giving a lecture at IHMC this very night.
So currently she's at Scripps Oceanographic Institute.
And she serves as the Vice Chancellor for Marine Sciences and Director of Scripps Oceanographic Institute. It's one of the leading positions in the world of oceanography.
She has a very impressive career history. So she went from being an oceanographer, and she actually has vast field experience, which she shares with us in today's interview. And then she moved into policymaking and working at a very high-level administrative position and a number of different positions. So she has a very eclectic and very interesting background to share with us today.
I think with no further ado, we should go directly to the interview with Margaret Leinen.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
So Dr. Leinen, I want to welcome you to STEM Talk today.
It's wonderful to be here.
So Dr. Leinen, just to start off as a tie-in to IHMC, when you were the assistant director of the National Science Foundation, IHMC's director, Ken Ford, was on the National Science Board, and he actually said that you guys had a lot of interactive experiences while you were at NSF. And he actually said that you were remarkably effective at your position. Can you tell us more about your experience with the National Science Foundation?
Sure. In 2000, then director of the National Science Foundation, Rita Caldwell, asked me to come to Washington to talk to her about coming to NSF as an employee. And she was interested in a development that actually involved the National Science Board. They had proposed that NSF find a mechanism to be able to coordinate environmental science, engineering, and education across the entire foundation, because the foundation is arranged in basically by fields: biology, math and physical sciences, geosciences, etc. So she was interested in how to break down barriers and boundaries across NSF. And she had called me because I had been doing something similar at the university where I was serving as a dean and vice provost. So we had a wonderful discussion. We actually met at a hotel, and she said she was going to have a breakfast meeting with me. So I arrive at the hotel, and there's this room that's the size of a huge office, and one side of it is this huge buffet. You could have fed 20 people of all the things that were there. And she came in, and she just completely cracked up. We were laughing and started off on this wonderful discussion about breaking down boundaries. And I think that the thing I remember most about that time was her willingness to consider all of the ways that you would look at interdisciplinary research, that you would collaborate across the boundaries of National Science Foundation. And many of the things that I brought to the National Science Board at the time were related to that desire to go across boundaries. And it's been a theme in my career. Many of my positions have been ones in which I explicitly had the job of connecting environment across many areas within an organization.
That's and that takes a certain skill set, to say the very least, to have everybody who normally speaks different languages, speaking on the same page and pulling together to work towards a common cause. I would think, at least.
Well, it does, and I think it takes an optimist, and that's me. I'm definitely a glasses half full kind of person, and but I think that it's also people want to do these things. It's not like they don't want to do them. They People want to be able to cross boundaries, and most of the time they feel that they do, but that the organization puts obstacles in front of them. So my job is to find out what the obstacles are and then try to erase them.
So you said that this has been a repeating theme in your career. What would you say the biggest adjustment was that you had to make moving from a leadership role as a researcher, which is kind of your first round career, to a leadership role at the administrative level?
I think that the biggest lesson that I learned, the biggest challenge always, is that when you come into an organization, you have a lot of ideas about what you would like to see that organization do. And, in most of the time when people go out to find a new leader of their organization, they're looking for somebody with ideas. But there's a delicate dance between the things that you think are important to do and that you would like to see done, and the things that the people in the organization want to do and want to see done. And you have to get to know why they want to do those things, and then try to form a bridge between your ideas and their ideas, and see what you can do with that, because it's really important that you draw on the power of the organization, and that's the things that people there want to do. I once went to one of these workshops on leadership, and I'll never forget, the person was going around the room asking, what's a leader? And one of the people said, a leader is a person who has followers. And it's really important, because if you're not working with them, then you're in front of them, and you could look back and find there's nobody there.
Yeah, I could see how that could happen. So can you tell us a little bit more about your current position at Scripps as the director of the Institution of Oceanography?
Yes, Scripps is the oldest academic research institution in the country in oceanography, and one of the oldest in the world. We just celebrated our 114th birthday, and although the name is Scripps Institution of Oceanography, there are as many people in earth science, atmospheric science, marine biology as there are in oceanography. So some of the exciting things that are going on here also are related to that, bridging across disciplines. For example, we're fortunate to be part of this wonderful university, UC San Diego, which has a medical school and a school of pharmacy, and we have a lot of joint appointments with those groups to be able to look at the whole area of human health and the oceans. So people don't tend to think about the ocean as affecting their health, and yet it does, and more so than just the safety of seafood and red tides or harmful algal blooms. But for example, when you're at the seashore and you take a big breath of that wonderful salt air, you're also inhaling thousands of viruses and bacteria from the ocean. So what's with that? Is that a bad thing? Are we in danger from that, or is it a good thing? Maybe they have conferred, maybe years of evolution, and breathing the salt air has conferred immunity to us. Some of these really interesting questions about how the ocean influences our health are great examples of something that you wouldn't necessarily associate with oceanography, but it's definitely a part of what we do, and we can do it because of the tremendous resources in health sciences here.
So that's very interesting. I never think about the potential health relationship. I mean, you do to some degree, but you don't think about the health relationship between the general population and the ocean. That's absolutely fascinating. So you said you're working with the Department of Pharmacology at UCSD on these projects?
The Skaggs School of Pharmacy and the School of Medicine. And then also biology and chemistry and engineering and so forth. It's just one example. Others, climate change impacts and adaptation. We've gone beyond detecting climate change and being able to attribute climate change or apportion climate change between the part that's natural and the part that is a result of our actions. Now we really need to understand the impacts of climate change on us, on, of course, the land that we live on, but also the oceans that cover so much of the globe, and to try to understand how we can adapt to it. That also is an area that's deeply interdisciplinary and calls on us to not only work with sciences, engineering, but social science and policy and the arts and humanities, education. All of these play a role in the ability of humans to adapt to this huge thing that's coming toward us.
So this ties right back into what you were talking about before, is being able to work with people on multiple levels and getting all of them, like you said, they want to work together, but just finding a way to optimally work together. So I didn't realize, you don't think about from the outside all the different components that would tie into a program of oceanography and climate research to that degree. That's really fascinating. So kind of going on that, you started a nonprofit that's called the Climate Response Fund. Can you tell us a little bit more about the goals of that organization?
Sure. The Climate Response Fund was founded at a time when people were starting to talk about doing research on what's called climate engineering, or purposefully doing things to mitigate climate change. Some examples are that people have talked about perhaps putting aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight away from the globe. And other people have talked about capturing carbon or sequestering carbon by influencing natural processes, such as the fertilization of the ocean that takes place naturally when dust containing iron lands on the ocean, because the ocean is far away from land, is very, very depleted in iron, and iron is a micronutrient for the plankton that use CO2. So these ideas have been out there for a long time, and people were starting to talk about doing research on them, or even, doing research so that we would know whether those techniques worked and whether they could be used. And of course, it's you don't go into the idea of purposefully altering the climate without thinking hard about it. And it's a very scary thing for people to contemplate. So, what was happening, and to a large extent still is happening, is that people have been so um, afraid of someone or some group undertaking this without knowing enough about it, that they called a halt to research as well as the deployment of these techniques. And so Climate Response Fund was really founded to have discussions and work on policy that would make it possible for research to be done safely on this very important topic. A new report of the National Academy of Sciences just came out this year, which again says the same thing, that we need to do the research and that we need to get beyond these barriers to be able to do the research.
So essentially provide a platform to work from, and then you can go from there.
Right, and to a large extent, that's a policy platform. How do you make a decision about whether the research can be done safely, whether it can be done responsibly? Who's in charge of saying that you could put more water vapor into the air in the Eastern Pacific? That's another idea, because it would help to form clouds and reflect back sunlight. So who gets to say whether you can do that?
So the Climate Response Fund, is it primarily scientists, or is it a combination of scientists and policymakers, citizens?
The Climate Response Fund itself was a group of scientists and policy experts, but it worked with the public, it worked with governments, it worked with scientific groups, it worked with nonprofits. So it was a facilitator of discussion.
So what's the status now?
It's hard to tell. This National Academy report was about the third or fourth big scientific study that called for research, and we aren't a lot closer to that. In the U.S., the research agencies have been very reluctant to fund research in this area, and in part that's because they have felt that there wasn't a good policy frame for it, and in part because they were very concerned about public response to this. There have been some groups that have been funded in Europe to look at this issue, and even those have had a great deal of difficulty with the research. There was a group in Great Britain that wanted to just make some measurements on a small amount of water vapor put into the atmosphere. And we're talking about essentially like vaporizing 5 gallons of water and putting it into the atmosphere and then measuring the droplet size and reflectivity and things like that. Definitely not making clouds the size of a city, no less anything larger. And the public outcry was incredible and just shut down the entire experiment.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research lab pioneering groundbreaking technologies aimed at leveraging and extending human cognition, perception, locomotion, and resilience.
Dr. Leinen, I'm going to take a few steps back. So, how you actually got into science in the first place. So, you've had an extensive research career that's covered a variety of aspects of oceanography and climatology. I have to tell you, I personally, when I was very young, my dream was to be a marine biologist. And I moved from Iowa to North Carolina when I was 9 years old, and went to the beach for the first time and fell in love and said, this is what I want to do. So my parents bought me Jacques Cousteau's Ocean World, and I carried it around in my backpack with me every day for about 3 years, which is probably why I have back problems now. But I can tell you it was absolutely fascinating to me, and I eventually kind of transitioned into science, and just seeing the ocean for the first time and how expansive it was and just being mesmerized by what it contained drew me into science in the first place. So can you give us a little bit more of a background as to how you got drawn into the marine sciences in the first place?
Well, my parents never bought me the Jacques Cousteau book. If they had, maybe although I'm old enough so that, I used to watch Sea Hunt on television, and I became interested in geology and studying the history of the Earth when I was in high school. And I when I went to college, I thought that I would study chemistry, and then I had sort of moved away from geology, but found it again in college. And it seemed to me that as long as people were talking about processes on land, that they were on firm footing, and that the geologists had a great idea about how things took place, because they had lots of things they could look at. But as soon as they started talking about what happened in the ocean, how deep sea environments formed and how deep sea sediments got there, that the stories got pretty tenuous. So I thought I would go off and do a degree in oceanography and then bring that back to geology and go on with my geologic studies. But I just got seduced by oceanography and never, I'm a geological oceanographer. I study the history of the oceans, but I never went back to land geology.
So it kind of went the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
That's very interesting. So essentially, even then, you were taking multiple disciplines. It is a repeating theme in your career. You take multiple disciplines. Indeed. Yeah, that's great. So kind of talking about your career as an oceanographer, I read that you were involved as both an organizer and a leader of the Joint Global Ocean Flux Study, which I remember reading about that before, and it's involved multiple research vessels in the Pacific, if I'm correct. And I can only imagine that had to be an exciting adventure. Can you tell us a little bit more about that project and any interesting stories that maybe came out of that project?
Oh, sure. No one's asked me about the Joint Global Ocean Flux Study, which we called JGOFS for the initials of Joint Global Ocean Flux Study. So the point was to look at the whole process of CO2 being taken up from the atmosphere by the microscopic plants in the ocean, the phytoplankton, then turning that into their tissue, being eaten by other things, recycling that in the ocean, the whole ocean part of the carbon cycle of the planet. So the ocean's role in really the thing that keeps the planet alive. So we had decided to look at different areas of the ocean as concerted studies. And if you look at the planet from the perspective of the Pacific Ocean, if you were looking at a globe from the Pacific, you would see that the equatorial Pacific extends across half of the planet. It's the largest biogeochemical or bioecological zone on Earth. It's just enormous. And it's very, very productive. And it also changes dramatically between El Nino times and non-El Nino times. So what we wanted to do was to be able to look at the equatorial Pacific during an El Nino and normal conditions and understand its role in the carbon cycle of the planet. So that's a pretty ambitious goal.
And how does I'm sorry to interrupt. How does it change between the El Nino times and how does that change?
During El Ninos, during normal times, there is a process that takes place at the equator that results in upwelling of deep waters, waters from several hundred feet below the surface of the ocean. And in those waters, there are abundant nutrients from the sinking of organic material and its breakdown by microbes. So where this upwelling takes place along the equator, there are a lot of nutrients that can support phytoplankton growth. And what happens during an El Nino is that a number of physical processes take place that result in that upwelling being limited and decreasing very substantially. So we wanted to look at the difference between a time when the ocean was very highly productive and one that it wouldn't be so biologically productive. So that's why El Nino and non-El Nino. So how do you do something like that? Well, first, you don't do it alone. You get all of your friends from around the globe who are oceanographers and who think that the equatorial Pacific is a cool place. And then you sort of look at what each of them can contribute over a period of time to that. So the U.S. project, I had 9 different cruises, and a cruise would be, a couple of months long in the equatorial Pacific. But then there were also cruises going on that were sponsored by Australia and New Zealand and Japan and Ecuador and Chile. So we were out there with a lot of people, and but the U.S. Looked at in great detail across from north to south across the equatorial Pacific, and also from the surface all the way to the bottom. So we looked at everything that was happening in the sunlit waters of the Pacific where all these plants were growing, but we also looked at everything that was happening deeper where microbes were breaking down all of that organic material. And we looked at the food web, who eats who and why and where and how often. And we also we used giant, they're called sediment traps. They're like a giant funnel that goes down to a small sampler, and it captures material that's falling through the ocean down thousands and thousands of feet. And then we also looked at the sediments. So it was, we had 70 different major scientists, and each of them had a group, students and postdocs and whatever, out there for on these 9 different cruises, and over a period of a couple of years. And it was a lot of fun. I got to know so many people that way that I didn't know before in oceanography. There were just getting together to discuss our work was a major activity. And I remember that when you have that many people, it's very expensive to get together. So you want it to be really cheap. So we put one of our logistics people in charge of finding a place that could hold all of us and had great facilities for meeting and was cheap. And what she came up with was a resort in Scottsdale, Arizona in August.
Exactly.
So the temperature was about 115. We were inside the whole time. Nobody wanted to go outside, but it was a wonderful, wonderful meeting. And
That's a good way to keep everybody in the room instead of going
yes,
out and exploring.
yes, indeed.
Well,
So some of the parts
wow.
of doing science that you don't think about, oceanographers holed up in the desert in Arizona in the middle of August to be cheap, to be able to get together and talk.
Like I said, that we always laugh because they started moving the first academic meetings that I went to about 10 years ago. Once I entered into the field of research, were in Maui and just beautiful locations, and they've moved in the last couple of years to places like Arizona and Las Vegas in the middle of the summer. So I think maybe
That's great.
I think your coordinator found a good way to keep everybody focused on the meeting. So that had to be just incredibly amazing. Just like you said, all the different tools that you guys were using. Did you enter the water yourselves, either as divers or in submersibles?
This wasn't a project that used submersibles. And because we were out in the middle of the Pacific, the water is extraordinarily deep, so we didn't do a lot of diving. But most of our work used samplers that were put over the side of the ship on wire that's wound onto a huge spool, and then we lower that to the depths that we want to sample. And it's that sounds kind of crude, like you just took a bucket on a rope and lowered it over, but it's anything but that. So many of these instruments are controlled remotely from the ship. So you have wire that is conducting cable, and you can send messages to the instrument. Other instruments are left on a mooring for a year at a time, and so they have to act autonomously, and they're very complicated with redundant systems to make sure that everything operates, and timers and so forth.
So you probably needed engineers on board as well to keep all of this running efficiently.
Absolutely. Engineers, technicians, the ship's crew. The ship's crew are a vital part of the work that we do. And most of them, oceanographic ship crews, especially in the US, that don't make what they could make if they were on commercial vessels. But most of them are there because they find it interesting too. And they like being with the oceanographers and, having each day be different and sharing in that discovery.
So you've spent a significant amount of time in your life at sea, and not just JGOFs, but some of the other projects that you've worked on over your career. What are some of the most fascinating things that you've witnessed while at sea, either above water or underwater?
Well, the first number one has to be the opportunity I had on my very first Alvin dive. Alvin is a 3-person submersible. And I had been doing research off Washington, about 250 miles west of the coast of Washington State, on an area called the Juan de Fuca Ridge. And it was a place, this ridge is a seafloor spreading center. And we had done a lot of work studying this system because we thought that there was hydrothermal activity, the hydrothermal vents that support this remarkable deep sea life. And we were quite sure that they were there, and we did several cruises to try to locate them and study the processes around them. And I was sampling one evening. I was dredging for rocks, and you can tell from the ship with this wire hanging over it and a big chainmail bag that's very, very heavy, and it has teeth all around the opening of it, and you're grappling for rocks. And the ship actually you can feel it move and tug as this thing goes across the bottom. And I wrote in the log after I had done it that I didn't think that we had gotten anything because I couldn't feel that tugging. And so the bag of non-rocks that I thought was empty was on its way up, and it takes a couple hours for this to come back up from depth. And so I went to have breakfast, and I heard all of this shouting down the corridor toward the rear of the ship, and somebody came running in and they said, "You've got to come out right away. You dredged hydrothermal sulfides, the rocks that form as a result of this hydrothermal activity." And I went out, and I'm actually sitting here in my office looking at the photograph of me sitting in the dredge after they had removed the sulfides from it with this huge smile on my face. It was really an amazing experience. And a year later, we went back and dove on that location with Alvin, the 3-person submersible. And again, it takes over an hour to get to the bottom as you sink slowly through the water, and it's completely dark. And you're in this small 6-foot diameter sphere. It's cold. You're keeping yourselves amused while you get there. And we finally got near the bottom, and the pilot of the submersible was, getting all of his gauges working and testing all the propulsion systems so that we could drive around. And he said, "Okay, we're about 30 feet off the bottom. We're going to slowly descend. Tell me as soon as you see the bottom out of the little portholes." So I've got my head down to the porthole and the other person in the submersible and I are both saying, "We can't see anything." And he said, "Well, it must be, some mud from the bottom that's been kicked up and everything. Let's just go down slowly." And all of a sudden, we couldn't see it, but he could see out of his porthole this huge hydrothermal system covered with worms and clams and spewing hot water. And I can't say over the podcast what he said, but of course he was concerned that we get out of this area of all this hot water and everything. So we went back up in the air and we drove off a little and came back down, and then sort of turned around and drove up to it, and then turned so that we could see it. And my very first Alvin dive landed in the middle of one of the largest hydrothermal vent systems that we've ever seen.
That was, I can't even, I bet you can relive that experience in your mind every day.
I'll never forget it.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And so you said you were talking about the life that covers these hydrothermal vents. So there are worms, and what else do you see down there?
There are clams, and there are a number of crabs that are very characteristic of these areas. The particular one that I dove on does not have shrimp, but some of the hydrothermal systems in the Atlantic Ocean have shrimp. Some of the hydrothermal systems in the Western Pacific have these large, sort of 2-3 inches across snails that are on them. So just, incredible organisms, usually very colorful, and they aren't found in any other areas. They're just found in these hydrothermal systems or other systems where nutrient-laden water comes out from the bottom of the seafloor.
So they're specifically adapted to these unique ecosystems.
They are. And the other thing that's absolutely unique about these systems is that they are not dependent on nutrients coming from the surface. So I talked about the equatorial Pacific, where the bottom life of the equatorial Pacific is dependent on that small amount of nutrient and organic material that falls through the water and lands at the bottom. But these systems, the base of the food chain of these systems is microbes that can actually synthesize using energy from chemicals in the water. So they use dissolved iron and manganese and sulfur as the energy source. And so they're not at all dependent on anything that's happening at the surface or the sun. All of the rest of life is dependent on the sun, but not these.
So, when you lectured here at IHMC, you identified several major threats to the ocean. What would you say are the biggest threats today?
I think the biggest threat to the ocean is our ignorance of it. The things that you talked about, acidification, sea level rise, the warming of the ocean, this whole process that I talked about of plant material from the surface sinking and then being regenerated by microbes. Microbes are like us, they use oxygen and they give off CO2. So all of that uses oxygen, and the in most areas of the ocean, there is what's called an oxygen minimum zone, where a lot of that regeneration takes place, and it's the using up of the oxygen by the microbes. In many areas of the ocean, we're seeing the thickness of those low oxygen areas increase very substantially and become larger. So that's yet another impact of what's going on. And all of those are very important, and many of them are going to affect us, like sea level rise, and we'll have to adapt to them. But I think the biggest problem is the lack of our ability to know all the answers and to be able to say precisely what will happen. So, for example, sea level rise. If you were to look at a map of the rate of sea level rise across the Pacific Ocean, you would find that the rate of sea level rise on the West Coast is 1/3 of what it is on the East Coast of Asia. So Asia sea level is rising 3 times faster there than it is here. We are pretty sure that that's because of a very large physical process that we refer to as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It's a kind of it's like a balance that goes back and forth across the entire Pacific over a period of a decade or more, and that once we get into the other phase of this oscillation, that the West Coast sea level rise will be 3 times faster than Asia. But we can't tell you when that will happen, and we can't tell you for sure that it will be 3 times faster. So that affects, our ability to tell people how long they have to prepare for sea level rise, and how how that's going to play out over the next decades. So it's very frustrating to people. We have to just say, you have to take the long view. You have to think about, if the age of your infrastructure is 40 years, you have to think about, will it be safe 40 years from now? And we can give you some probabilities for that, but we can't tell you, okay, in 25 years, this is what it's going to be. The same with acidification. You hear a lot about the impact of acidification on oyster farms in Oregon and Washington, but the distribution of the areas in which acidification is taking place is also something that we don't know very well. And we don't know it because it's so hard to measure pH in the ocean. It's very, very complicated. And in fact, the Schmidt Foundation, Wendy Schmidt and Eric Schmidt's foundation, recently funded an X Prize to build the best pH meter for the oceans. Actually two. One that would be the most accurate, and another that would be the cheapest. To try to be able to spur innovation around this and get us some instruments that we can go out and use to answer these questions. So that's what I mean about, our ignorance and our lack of ability to really measure at the time and space scales that we need to answer the questions that people are asking us.
Is there anything positive that we're learning with respect to how the oceans are evolving and responding to these changes that they're experiencing?
One of the things that we're finding is that some of the systems that we're most worried about really have greater resilience than we thought. So coral reefs. So corals make their skeletal material out of calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate dissolves in acid. So everybody's been very concerned about the future of coral reefs. But one of the things that we're finding is that if you go to coral reefs that are not being strongly affected by pollution and physical disruption, coral reefs in marine protected areas and sanctuaries, that the corals there are much more resilient to acidification than corals, for example, in the Caribbean, where there's so much nutrient pollution coming into the ocean and so much disruption from fishing, from boats, and so forth. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we will learn how to enhance the resilience of some of the parts of the ocean that we're most worried about. May not work for everything, but the oceans aren't going to die. We will be powerfully impacted, but they have been through a lot, and there's a great genetic treasure trove of resilience built in to marine organisms over these billions of years of evolution. And so who knows, buried in the DNA of corals may be some resilience inherited from other times, past oceans that were very different.
So in the past, part of your research has included paleooceanography. Were there any times in our history or even the Earth's history, where the oceans were more acidic than they are today?
Yes, there definitely have been times when the ocean has been more acidic than it is now. The thing that so people say, well, if it's been that more acidic in the past, why worry now? The problem is the pace at which we're acidifying the ocean. And the other times when this happened, it happened over tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And so there was a lot of time for organisms in the ocean to adapt and to get used to these conditions. And that's another part of our ignorance of the ocean. We don't know how resilient things are to rapid change.
I don't always listen to podcasts, but when I do, I listen to STEM Talk, interviewing the most interesting people in the world of science and technology. Stay curious, my friends.
you mentioned that pH measurement is difficult. Why is pH measurement difficult?
The pH in the ocean is dependent on, well, pH is a measure of the hydrogen ion content of something. And in the simple experiments that everybody did in school, where you added something like hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid to a compound and watched it dissolve, you had one kind of acid, and you can measure the pH very easily, and the conditions that generate that pH are very simple. In the ocean, you are measuring the pH, the hydrogen ion concentration, in this huge mixture of all kinds of elements. So the principal acid in the ocean is really bicarbonate. It's one hydrogen, one carbon, and 3 oxygen atoms. And it's what we call a weak acid, which means that it can accept hydrogen ions and become more basic, or it can give off hydrogen ions, generating more acidity. And in addition, there are lots of other acids. Just because that one's the most common, there are lots and lots and lots of other species that are capable of giving off hydrogen ion. And so when you're measuring it, you're measuring the sum of an extraordinary number of these reactions. And all of this chemistry affects the measuring device. And that's what makes it so difficult. So it's the chemistry itself. Then the second thing is making this measurement stable. So the response of instruments to measure pH in the laboratory is notoriously subject to drifting. So that you have to go and calibrate the instrument over and over again. Every day that you start measuring, you calibrate. In most laboratories, every time you do a new batch of samples, you calibrate. Well, you can't go out and pull a sensor up from 1,000 feet down and calibrate it and then send it down again. Yeah. So you have to find ways of making that instrument stable. And that's been another huge challenge.
Is that an area of research that your institution delves into as far as development of tools that can be used for research?
Absolutely. So our Scripps Institution of Oceanography is the home of the standards for measurement. So one of the things that we do is that we get samples of seawater, we analyze it, we remove all of the bacteria and everything from it. We analyze it very carefully, and we measure its pH with extreme accuracy. And then we bottle that up in little vials, and we send it to places that request it to use as a standard. So that's the first thing we do. And that's a whole service that we do for the rest of the world. The second thing is that we develop instrumentation for measuring pH. And actually, one of our the sensors that we contributed to is in the X Prize competition.
Very cool. So
Yeah.
it's not just collecting data, but it's development of tools that can be used across the board for other applications as well.
Right. And developing, and that's sort of the instrument for measuring the pH, but then what you put that instrument in can be different. So, for example, if you wanted to go out and measure the pH off your local pier, you wouldn't require as much ability of the instrument not to drift, because you could take it back to the lab and calibrate it as if you were putting it out in the middle of the ocean and leaving it there for a year. So we also make a wide variety of different applications of these instruments. And so there's even one that's on a surfboard, so that you can essentially, use it in the surf zone to look at pH variations in the inshore environment where waves are breaking and lots of things are happening. So it's not just the pH sensor itself, but the package that it's in.
Okay, so I've got one more question, kind of stepping back. Specific to Pensacola issues that we deal with here, so we look at petroleum runoff from the asphalt, and also runoff that promotes phosphate growth from lawns, from golf courses, from farming. So this is a problem that we experience here in Pensacola. Are these issues studied elsewhere that you know of?
Absolutely. So both of those examples you gave are what are called non-point source pollution, or non-point source runoff. Point source pollution is where you have a pipe that is, putting sewage or some other pollutant into the ocean. But these are all cases where rain is falling on land, and then that's all running off the land and into the ocean. And both of those organic pollutants from both natural organic sources, as well as especially transportation sources, is very, very important. And it has been studied in great detail. Likewise, phosphorus and nitrogen. Both of those are important because just as nitrogen and phosphorus are nutrients that we use in our gardens for plants, they are nutrients for the plants in the ocean. And so they result in enhanced growth of algae and phytoplankton and other plants in the ocean. So these are big concerns everywhere where there are people, and those people live near the coast.
So to some degree, human infrastructure itself, actually probably to a very large degree, affects the ocean's health.
Yes, and you used the term infrastructure, and that can be infrastructure that's in the ocean or on the ocean or next to the ocean, like ships or piers or constructed coastal defenses, like seawalls and berms and so forth. And then there are also all of the things that wind up in the ocean. So you've talked about chemicals that wind up in the ocean, but one of the things that people have heard a lot about are plastics in the ocean. And plastics are very durable, as you know. They exist in landfills for centuries, and when they get into the ocean, they float around in the ocean for a long time too. And they do break down somewhat from sunlight, but then that breaks them into smaller pieces. And as the pieces get smaller, they get mistaken for food by seabirds and fish and so forth. So you can go onto the web and look at literally thousands of photos of fish, of seabirds, and so forth that have been caught, whose stomachs are full of plastic, and then on the other hand, that floating plastic is a home for algae, and it makes a little microcosm. But it's I think the biggest thing that people worry about, other than not wanting to see a lot of plastic in the ocean, is the effects on larger organisms, fish, and of course fish are eaten by marine mammals. So by some marine mammals, and they are also eaten by larger fish. So they can affect the top predators in the ocean.
So essentially, the plastic accumulates as it goes up the food chain.
Well, yes, in the sense that a stomach full of plastic has accumulated there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen some of the pictures from Midway Island. My father was stationed there in the Marine Corps, and I've seen pictures of the seabirds there, and it's just devastating to look at when you see the carcasses and the piles of plastic. So I'm going to ask you kind of another aside question. I understand that you've worked extensively to entice women to enter the sciences, and would you say that females are significantly underrepresented in the field of geosciences?
Some parts of geoscience. The history of women in science over the last 50 years is really an extraordinarily good news story. When I entered science, there were really very few women in science, and even fewer that were professors at teaching other young women about science. But the numbers have grown steadily, and as we've learned about the various ways that all of us have biases, and as we've looked at the way that those biases affect us in choosing colleagues, whether those are students or postdocs or other faculty members or people who work in our labs, or people who get awards, we've learned what we can do to deal with that bias as well. Some fields of science, many areas of biology, have more women at the undergraduate level than men. That doesn't necessarily still mean, or doesn't necessarily translate to having just as many women in faculty positions or in leadership positions, but it is definitely a situation where things are much better than they were. I wish I could say the same for other underrepresented groups, and here geoscience really has a challenge. Most people think that fields like engineering or math and physics would have the least number of underrepresented groups as students or as faculty, but that's not the case. It's actually geoscience. And the history is really interesting. You know, I think some of it has to do with of course, some of it has to do with what you think is a good thing to go into. And if you're a child from a minority group and you don't see anybody in your group that is a geoscientist or that works in geoscience or something, you know, why would you think of that as a career? But I think also some other things are a challenge. One is a lot of the jobs that aren't in academia are in resource industries like oil, gas, mining, etc. And those have a real history of boom and bust. And so a lot of people look at them and say, well, I don't want to go into that because I might be out of a job in 10 years. And so that's been difficult. Another thing is that they've been looked at as exploitive industries. So think about where, if you are from a minority and you think about oil and gas, you're thinking about family members or people who work in that who are on oil and gas rigs or that are miners or whatever, and it doesn't suggest an attractive way forward when the science side of it is a very attractive way forward. So it's been a real challenge for us to find ways to get people into these fields. And for oceanography, I live in San Diego, you would be amazed at how many children that are, third, fourth, fifth grade in San Diego have never been to the beach. they've never seen the ocean in person.
I would have never guessed that. You just think that that's a given living out there. It's so beautiful out there.
That I also found that was the case in Florida, in Virginia, in Rhode Island. We tend to think, those of us who work in the field assume that everybody has been to the ocean, but it's just not the case. And how would you come up with the idea that that's what you should do when you're in the middle of land and you see weather and atmospheric phenomena all around you, and you certainly see things on land, and you hear about and you look at the sky, you can dream about space, but the ocean might be pretty far away from your thoughts.
Do you have any people that you would consider to be personal mentors, or people that you've looked to during your career for feedback and advice?
Absolutely. And there have been people who have been role models, and there have been people who have been mentors. And the distinction is that a mentor takes a really active role in your career, and then they really care about you and about your success. And many times they're advocates for you as well. While a role model is someone you more or less see from afar. Or some people are both role models and mentors, but I've had both. And I've had both men and women who have given just extraordinarily generously of their time to listen to me and to support me during tough times, and also to be a sounding board as I thought about big decisions. When I was thinking about whether I was going to take this position, one of the first people that I called was one of my most important mentors, to talk with her about thinking about this particular career change.
Well, Dr. Leinen, I want to say thank you so much for taking time today to speak with us. And, I wish you the best with your position at Scripps Institution of Oceanography.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much again for your time today. This has been great, and we will talk to you soon.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM Talk.
STEM
STEM
Talk.
Talk.
STEM Talk.
So that was an incredibly fascinating interview with Dr. Leinen. In particular, I found her recap of her role as a young scientist and her role in discovery of some things that had never been seen in the underwater world. And you could hear the passion in her voice. And I thought it was really cool when she referred to the picture that she's looking at of her young scientist self across from her, sitting at her desk. And, I think as a scientist, we all have those moments in our history where, there's something that we in particular are passionate about, and it's kind of this memory that will stick with us for the rest of our career.
Absolutely, Don. Margaret has had a really terrific career as a scientist, as a leader, as a policymaker, and she's really impacted science in the United States and around the world.
It was absolutely an honor to talk with her today.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.